Pleased to have Sarah Allen join us today. Sarah earned her doctorate at UC Berkeley and has spent more than 40 years studying marine mammals and seabirds, beginning at Point Reyes National Seashore, stint in Antarctica, sounds very exciting, and lots of work here in Northern California. She's authored more than 100 publications. And she recently retired as a research coordinator for the National Park Service, where she worked to match promising early career scientists in the UC system with park science needs. What really sets Sarah apart and why we're anxious to have her here is her commitment to using science to inform the public and guide land management decisions. She has a deep understanding of the need to find the sometimes elusive balance between conservation and recreation, particularly here on the California coast. And that's something we find ourselves confronting here at Sea Ranch. Today, Sarah will be helping us understand the biology and ecology of the harbor seal. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen as your microphone has been muted. Catherine Arnold will monitor the chat entries and select questions to present to Sarah after her presentation. Because we have more than 100 attendees, we are unfortunately limited to a question and answer format rather than an interactive discussion. I'm sure you all understand. Thanks again for attending, and I'll pass it over to Dr. Sarah Allen. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you for all of you for attending this on a beautiful Sunday, though brisk day in the afternoon. I appreciate you coming and listening about basics about harbor seals. And when Sandy approached me, he said that there was a great interest in not just understanding harbor seal biology and how they might use an area such as Sea Ranch. And so that is what I'm going to present to you, but I'll also weave in science that has been accumulated over the past several decades, not just by myself, but by many people who study harbor seals, because they are a common seal found throughout the Pacific, and that makes them very interesting, though they can be difficult to study. So without any further ado, I'll proceed. The outline that I put together is first to talk about coastal ecosystems and where harbor seals fit in, and then drill down into the natural history and the current science of harbor seals, and then wrap up on marine conservation. First, I want to step way back and just look at the great Pacific Ocean that we have, and there's tremendous biodiversity in the Eastern Pacific, which is our coastline, the eastern boundary of the Pacific Ocean. And what we have is called the California Current, which flows along from Vancouver Island south to Baja. And this creates upwelling along the coast, and it's one of the reasons why there's such great biodiversity here. But also, we have coastal wind-driven upwelling, which is what we're experiencing today, where the wind goes along the coast and blows the surface waters away, and deep water, which is rich in nutrients, upwells to the surface. And that is the basis of the food web that makes this such a fabulous, very biodiverse area. And harbor seals are a member of that. There are also very diverse habitats in this coastal area. We have different bottom types from sandy to rocky, and depth has a big influence on that for the habitats, but also the rugosity. So that's the roughness of the bottom type. You might have a rocky flat plateau, or you might have boulders, and that's different sorts of habitats for animals. And then there's biogenic habitat, which would be kelp beds and seagrasses, or corals if we had corals along our shoreline. And then finally, we have oceanographic features, which are in constant motion, and they're based on the topography. So off of Bodega Head and Point Reyes Headlands, you have these wind-driven waters that are pushed offshore because of the effect of the Coriolis, of the rotating of the Earth. These create currents off, which you can see in this slide here, and it creates a very dynamic habitat that is consistent based on the winds, but dynamic. And this is actually quite a complicated food web. This is a very basic one that I pulled off of the web of the internet, and from marine mammals down to the smallest phytoplankton. And there is great diversity within this coastal area. However, there are a few species like krill. This is a big slug of krill, and forage fish, which form the basis of the food web. So if something happens to the forage fish or the krill, that changes the biodiversity of this food web. And of course, there's the unexpected. This is a Pycnopodia, which is called a sun star, and they disappeared recently off of your coastal shoreline, and they were very important for controlling sea urchins. So it's also a very fragile ecosystem. Even though it's diverse, it's dependent on certain organisms, and when you take out those organisms, those ecosystems readjust. So pinnipeds are an apex predator in these ecosystems. And when I say pinnipeds, those are wing-footed carnivores. They form a suborder underneath carnivores, and they come with very diverse species, from fur seals to sea lions to walrus even, and to elephant seals. And the differences are based on different morphology and physiology for the different species. Some have specialized body forms, such as long flippers or a big nose. Others have modified teeth for grasping different prey items. And they have different ways of retaining heat. Fur seals depend on their fur, whereas elephant seals and sea lions depend on their blubber for heat retention. The nursing periods for these different species varies, with sea lions staying with their young for up to 6 months, whereas seals such as elephant seals and harbor seals only stay with their pups for 30 days, a very short period. And then their molting varies a lot. Some molt on land, some molt in the water. But this group is quite diverse. Again, for the Eastern Pacific, there are 6 different species. All pinnipeds give birth on land, and this forces them to use certain terrestrial sites where they can give birth. This happens to be at Ana Nuevo Island, one of those rare places when you get almost all 6 species. There are 2 different families of pinnipeds, the Otariids, which are the eared seals, and the Phocids, which are the earless. They're not really earless, I'll show you in a minute, but the earless seals. The Otariids, which are the sea lions, can rotate their pelvis underneath them so they can walk on all 4s. In fact, they can even gallop on land. Whereas Phocid seals cannot rotate their pelvis. They have shorter front flippers, and again, they have those lack of ears. So here are, of the 6, they fall into 2 families on the Eastern Pacific. Here is a harbor seal, which you'll see off of your Sea Ranch area, probably not an uncommon sight like this. And there you see, they don't have an ear flap, but they have a hole where the ear is. They also have these really long whiskers, and there are neurons, bundles of neurons at the base of these whiskers, which detect movement. So when these whiskers are extended out, they can actually feel water movement, and it's how they track in the water that is not clear for them. Most of our shoreline is pretty cloudy water. So they navigate based on their detection of water movement and sound underwater. So again, Otariids and Phocides, and they use different terrestrial habitat, and you can see that they move very differently through the water. Whereas a sea lion uses its front flippers for swimming through the water. That's where the wing-footed term came from, whereas harbor seals really propel themselves with their hind flippers, and they rotate their pelvis for propelling themselves through the water. But that restricts how they can use land-based habitat. So being able to crawl up on a sandy beach or low-lying rocks is what a harbor seal or elephant seal is restricted to. Whereas a sea lion, because they can rotate their pelvis, they can crawl quite high up on rocky shorelines. And you see that at Fort Ross and the rocks off of there, where those sea lions are way high up on rocks. Now drilling down in the fossid seals, there are two species in the Eastern Pacific off of California, harbor seals and northern elephant seals. And they're the extremes of pinnipeds generally, because elephant seals are the largest of all pinnipeds. They are up to 5,000 pounds, whereas harbor seals are very diminutive in comparison. They're about 200 to 300 pounds. There's no sexual dimorphism with harbor seals, whereas elephant seals, there's extreme sexual dimorphism. There are many other ways that they differ, but that's the easy way to tell them apart. Now I'm going to shift to the natural history and current science of seals. And if you have questions in these different categories, just hold them and present them at the end, and I'll answer them. So first, I want to look at just the general species description, and then I'll talk about their cycles and the annual cycles, their population numbers, and things that influence their population numbers, both environmental and human factors. As I said initially, harbor seals are found throughout the northern latitudes of the world. They're called the common seal for a reason. But our subspecies occurs from British Columbia down to Baja California, and that's called Phoca vitulina ricardzi. So that's our subspecies, but they're very similar in their habits throughout the world. So I've talked to researchers who study harbor seals in different areas, and there's much that's similar between them. And some of the basic things about them is they tend to be year-round resident. They're not seasonal in their presence as you see with sea lions or elephant seals. There are individuals that do migrate to different areas and disperse, but there tends to be a resident population, and you've probably seen this at Sea Ranch. They rest on shore almost every day. And the reason for this is because they are small. They need to be on shore and warm up and rest. They don't have that blubber layer that elephant seals have that allow them to dive deep and be in cold water for months on end. And they're exclusively coastal because of that reliance on hauling out on a regular basis. They're not very vocal compared to, say, elephant seals that trumpet, or sea lions that are barking, and you hear them barking probably in Fort Ross area. The pups, though, can be very vocal. Their breeding season is March through June, so we're right in the middle of it right now. And they have what's called delayed implantation. So they pup the same time every year, but the blastocyst does not implant in the uterine wall. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And I want to emphasize that in our area, Central California, we have a very high concentration of harbor seals compared to other parts of the state. Think of Southern California. There are not many terrestrial places where they haul out and give birth in Southern California. Children's Pool is one that's in San Diego area, but most of the places where they occur in Southern California are on the Channel Islands offshore. They are what we call a prototypical fossid seal. They're very streamlined. They're basic fossid seal. If you looked at seals in the Arctic or the Antarctic that are fossid seals, very much the same body form. But there's little sexual dimorphism for harbor seals. As a friend of mine says, you can't tell the difference until the male drops his pants, which is not very often. They roll over, and sometimes you can tell. You can tell a female because she might be nursing a pup, but other than that, it's not easy. And they roughly about 200 to 300 pounds. So, you know, they're human size, maybe a little heavier than us, but human size. And their teeth are serrated, which is important in how they prey. And here's an example of what those teeth look like in that serration. So when they grab prey, they can hold on to it better. And think about, I'll talk in more detail about the type of prey they eat, but hagfish is one. It's considered very slippery. Also, hake and halibut are other examples of their type of prey. These teeth are unique to harbor seals. You don't see this with elephant seals. Elephant seals have very simple teeth in comparison. Harbor seals also come in many color phases, which distinguishes them from the other pinniped species. It's like a thumbprint. So you have very dark animals and very light ones. We call these common seals with the dark spots on light, or light spots on dark. And there is a climb from north to south, where in the north you tend to have lighter colored harbor seals, and in the south you tend to have these darker animals. In our region, we have a mix of coloration and spot formations. And there are seals that are quite red, and you'll see these, some along the coast, but lots in San Francisco Bay, where I studied them. Almost 40% of the harbor seals that I studied in San Francisco Bay had red fur, but they molted it during the molt season, which I'll talk about in a minute. But this is iron oxide. It's not unique to San Francisco Bay. In fact, red seals have been seen throughout the world, in Ireland and to Japan, but it's a very small percentage. To have 40% in San Francisco Bay is very interesting. They also have algae growing on them. And we did a study at Point Reyes with Floyd Hayes, who looked at these two individuals in the bottom that were located in Bodega, where they were swimming. And this algae tends to be on adult females. It's mostly on females in estuaries. And the type of algae is primarily ulva. There have been 4 different species of algae identified on harbor seals, but ulva, the leafy green stuff, is the dominant type. And one theory is that these pregnant females are floating, spending a lot of time floating in the water, so they're a good substrate for algae to grow on. And you probably see some along the coast here. Now again, the pinnipeds lead this dual existence. They are using their terrestrial haul-out sites for giving birth on land, physiological need, like harbor seals, they have to haul out regularly to rest. And these sites have historical significance. So one site in Japan and Hokkaido was documented as being used for at least 1,000 years. So these are their cities, their villages, where they gather and have historically gathered over perhaps centuries. So that's something important to remember. It doesn't mean that they're totally fixed on just one site. They can move around, but there are historical significance to these haul-out sites. But they make their living and they travel in the marine system. And these are very diverse habitats that they use, from tidal mudflats and tidal rocky exposed areas to sandy beaches. This is the Russian River, and sandbars. That both tidal mud bars and sandy beaches. And these are the different haul out sites in our region where the seals haul out. Now there are smaller sites, but these are the ones where at least 100 animals have been documented. And they range for Central California all the way from Pebble Beach and all the way up here to Sea Ranch, Fort Ross. In San Francisco Bay, there are actually about 5 more haul out sites, but these are the larger ones that I'm showing. And here's an example down in Monterey Bay, which is a little beach where they gather on shore. And again, you see that whole mix of coloration of the animals, from dark to very light spotted ones. This is a place called Double Point at Point Reyes, and it's one of the largest colonies in the state. It's not accessible by foot. It's at the base of a rocky cliff, and during the molt season, you can see over 1,000 animals. So it's a really rich area for harbor seals. And this is a site called Drake's Estero, also at Point Reyes, another very large colony. And the seals haul out on all these sandbars that are exposed during low tide throughout the Estero. And so here are examples of mudflats and sandbars within the Estero where they regularly haul out at low tides. These are rocky sites off of, they're called Castro Rocks, off of the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge. And you can see lots of red harbor seals there. And again, they use them when they're exposed at low tides. Some of these sites you might recognize driving along Highway 1 or in the Russian River. This is a site that's where seals haul out on logs that are exposed, photographed by Jamie Hall. And then, of course, your old favorite, the Russian River, the mouth of the Russian River where they haul out. They also use human structures, both ones that are broken down piers. This is in Tamales Bay, and the seals haul out of here at any tide when they're resting. It's not really a pupping site. It's where they rest when in between foraging trips. This structure in Alameda was actually created for harbor seals because a site where they used to haul out disappeared, and it was modified. And so the scientists put together and the local community created this haul out site just for harbor seals. And in fact, they use it. Now, I said that the seals have cycles, and I referred to tide and time of day. Those are important in a daily cycle, and those change from day to day and season to season. But there is a real tie to that, which I'll go into more detail. And then also they have seasonal cycles, which I'll, again, also go into more detail. The daily haul out, based on watching animals for 24 hours a day, and I did this with satellite and radio tag seals, you'll find a very strong correlation between time of day and the number of seals hauled out. And the peak tends to be the middle of the day when it's the warmest. Not surprising, they're warming up. So for these sites that are exposed at all times of day, based on the tides, you'll have a very strong correlation. There are some animals that like to haul out at night, but in general, you have a strong correlation with daylight. That's also arguably important because fish that they might feed on migrate to the surface during the night, so they're more accessible for seals to feed at night. So you've got two factors that would influence them being hauled out primarily during the midday. But there's also a very strong tidal factor on their presence on these haul outs. And when it's low tide, you have high numbers, and then they fall off as the tide rises. And they'll stay on these sites as long as they can. You'll see they have their flippers up in the air. That's because they lose a lot of heat in the rear flippers. So they have their flippers up in the air, and then they're anchoring their body on a rock that's there. Here's an interesting site, Myers Grave, that Jamie Hall photographed, and that they use this site both at low and high tide. So it's an interesting site that's quite different. So that's their daily use, and now I'll talk about their annual cycle. And again, we're right in the middle of the pupping season, which begins in March and extends through mid-May into beginning of June. And the mating occurs after that pupping season. So the females don't all give birth at the same time, but they give birth and they're with their pups for 30 days. So you have this bell-shaped curve where most of the pups are born by the end of April, and then the number of pups falls off because it's hard to identify them later. And the males start mating with the females. They come into estrus when they wean their pups at about 30 days. So the mating occurs from late May into June. And they have what's called delayed implantation. So actually the blastocyst, which is the early formation of the fetus, doesn't implant in the uterine wall, until around August or September. But that means that they give birth the same time. So it's delayed implantation for a couple months, and they give birth about the same time every year. And you find this with temperate mammals, not just with pinnipeds. You find it with bats and all sorts of mammals, so that they're keyed into the cycle of food that they might be dependent on. Pinnipeds that are around the equator don't have this delayed implantation, and they might give birth different times of the year. So just be aware of that. They molt from June into August, early August. So that's a molting period. That's when they lose their hair, and they tend to spend more time on shore when they're molting. So they molt over about a 3-week period, an individual, but each sex and age class molts at a different time. So first you have juveniles molting, and then you have adults molting. And so it's a protracted period that lasts from June into early August. So that tends to be the cycle. And then during the fall into the winter months, some animals disperse and some stay, but they're spending more time in the water. So during the pupping season, they could spend time on shore up to about 10, 12 hours per day while they're nursing young pups and resting on shore. And when the molt occurs, they could spend many hours on shore because the hair follicles grow faster when they're molting when they're in sunlight. So there's a dependence on that. But in the winter months, they tend to haul out for about 8 hours per day. So that gives you an idea of the different use of the terrestrial sites throughout the year. So I'm going to drill down now into the pupping season. So a female gives birth to just one pup per year. They do skip years, but they tend to give birth every year. And females can recognize their individual pups based on their seeing them, smelling them, and if a pup vocalizes. So that's why you hear those pups vocalize. It'll have a female key into their pup, and they might hear a pup vocalizing. They'll go and investigate and smell the pup, and if it's theirs, then they're going to reunite with it. And these pups can swim at birth, which makes this very different. This species very different from other pinnipeds that cannot swim at birth. And the pups can swim within an hour of birth. And they ride the back of the female. You've probably seen this at Sea Ranch. And as they grow older, they're less reliant on being next to the female. This birth sequence was photographed by Jamie Hall. And you can see here the head first, and that's usually is what I saw probably 100 births, and it's only rarely did I see a tail first presentation, head first, which would make sense if they're born in the water, on the edge of the water. And you can see it's expressed out, and then there's still the amniotic sac on the pup, and the female immediately turns around and starts nosing the pup. So that's part of the smell. So this bonding of the first hour is very important. So this is not unique to marine mammals. For people, that bonding is extremely important. The placenta is passed within an hour of giving birth, and the umbilical cord breaks immediately. Some newborn pups have this whitish to grayish coat. It's called lanugo. And in the subspecies in Alaska, this coat is retained because it's a downy fur. It keeps them warmer. Whereas pups tend not to be born with lanugo down here. There is some thought that lanugo coated pups are less mature, or they're premature, but that isn't always the case. But there is a tendency for prematurity if lanugo is still present on these newborn pups. And here you see the typical spot pattern, which is their thumbprint. Here is an example of a newborn pup, and they still have that umbilical cord attached for about 3 days. And this is a weaned pup. So they weigh 50 pounds when they're weaned in 30 days, but they weigh 24 pounds when they're born. So they gain a lot of weight in that 30 days, but they're swimming. So they're also using up a lot of energy. Now here's a range of different sizes of pups. And I'll give you a second to think how many there might be here in this picture. But there's all different sizes. And so here you go. These are all different pups, 10 of them here. This is a very small pup here. This is a mid-sized one, and hard to believe, but this is a weaned pup. So that's a size difference in 30 days. Amazing. This is another weaned pup. So you see the different range of sizes. Here's a pup that's nursing. And so sometimes you might mix up a weaned pup with an adult, but in fact, it's a weaned pup. They're just very large, all that rich milk. Then the mating occurs in the water. And this sequence was photos was taken by a friend of mine who was on the Farallon Islands when she saw this behavior in March. So mating can take place earlier, but it takes place in the water, and you see this nosing, rolling. I actually observed mating behavior on the shoreline years ago, but it's extremely rare to see. And usually it's in water that's opaque. You cannot see it through the water. But here she was watching. Here is one nosing between the flippers. So they're smelling as this female in estrus. And there's biting around the neck. And you'll see this. Males actually have what are called territories, maritories, because they're marine territories. And one study by Sean Hayes, he came to Drake Sestero and he identified these maritories ranging in size from 3 acres to 21 acres. And it's usually offshore where females are with the pup nursing on land. The maritories are usually associated with those. And the way he had identified the size of the maritory was he had a hydrophone, and he did a playback, just like for birds. He played back the sound of the males making underwater. And what happened is the male that had the territory attacked his hydrophone. So he started moving the hydrophone back away from where this male was attacking it. And when it stopped attacking it, that's how he identified the range of that maritory of that male. Now I'm shifting to the molt season. And again, this is June into August, and they shed their fur annually. It's just like a dog shedding annually, but in the case for harbor seals, they're shedding it more intensively during a short period of time. So here's an example of one that's fully molted, and here's a red one that's starting to molt. You can see it's got a circle there where it's molted, and it tends to be molted on the sides. And here's one partially molted. And here's a red one that really sees it's molting off that red fur and that bright, shiny fur that's underneath. Now I want to give an example of the differences of sites. Some sites are important for pupping, some for foraging in the winter, and some are just used about the same year round. And this is from a study in San Francisco Bay. 3 sites. One was Castro Rocks, which is underneath the Richmond San Rafael Bridge. Yerba Buena Island, which is near the Bay Bridge, a little island there, and Maury Slough, which is in the South Bay where a lot of pupping occurs. And this black line is Maury Slough, and this is showing the cycle of presence of seals at Maury Slough for 3 different years, 98, 99, into 2000. And you can see that during the winter and fall, Maury Slough is not a very important haul out site, but in the pupping season and the molt, it's very important to harbor seals, and then it falls off. So this is important for raising pups and molting undisturbed. Castro Rocks is this orange line, and you can see it's pretty flat line. It's used year round, less so in the fall, in the winter, but really pretty flat, used year round. And then finally, Yerba Buena Island, it's not used in the fall, but it's important in the winter and not so much in the pupping season. So it's not an important pupping site, but it's very important in the winter months because that's where herring are spawning, and they're feeding intensively on herring there. So this is a resting site. So you can see that there's a difference between these 3 different haul out sites. And also there's an annual difference. And in 1998 was an El Nino year, and there were less animals hauled out to pup. As you can see in Maury Slough in 98, compared to 99 and 2000. It was just a low number because in El Nino year, less food available for them. So just be aware of those differences. And we discovered this based on putting radio, satellite tags, and flipper tags on seals, which is pretty intensive to do. It takes a lot of people to do it, and it's very difficult. So it's not done very often. But you gain tremendous information about harbor seals by tracking these individuals, because it's very hard to identify harbor seal individuals when they're at sea or even when they're on a haul out site. And what we were able to find is a lot about what they ate and where they ate. And they feed on a range of species of fish and invertebrates. This is hagfish here, rockfish, halibut, and squid are very important to their diet. Here's a sand dab. But forage fish really drive a lot of their diet. But of course, they also like salmon. You can't mix that picture up with any other species of fish. These pictures are taken by Jamie Hall, who photographed them at the Russian River. And lamprey was determined to be a very important food at the mouth of the Russian River. And this was a study done by a graduate student there. Also, flounder and a bottom fish were very important in these areas. In one study done up in Puget Sound, the researchers discovered that seals, what they fed on varied per season. So in the spring, they really liked herring, which is the clupid. They liked adult salmon during the summer and fall. And they liked a gatid, which is a kind of a rockfish cod in the winter months. So there was a lot of variation, but you can see that there are certain species kind of drove their diet at different times of year. And the same would be true for the Sea Ranch area, and I'll get into that in a minute. This was a different study in San Francisco Bay done looking at the bottom type and depth, different factors that influence where they foraged and the type of prey. But there are three things that stood out, even though they looked at human activity and human fishing and outflows, such as from Chevron and places like that. They found that bottom relief, so bottom type, made a difference. The type benthic prey, so things that are on the bottom, like flounder, were important in San Francisco Bay. And then distance from their haul out sites. So it made a difference if they were hauled out at YBI, for example, and where they foraged versus some other site. So that was one study. So you see how they're adapting to different food in different places of where they are between the Puget Sound and San Francisco Bay site. In another study where I tagged the seals in Point Reyes, during the winter months, they ranged all the way down to Monterey and all the way up to the Smith River. So a tremendous range where certain individuals dispersed, but there were resident animals, ones that didn't range at all. They stayed at Point Reyes. They never went anywhere but Point Reyes for the whole year. But you can see how important Point Reyes was to a whole range of harbor seals. Another study by Harvey and Goley showed similar things where seals hauled out. These were tag sites, were yellow places. So they were tagged at Maury Slough, Castro Rocks, and Point Reyes. And haul out sites are orange squares, triangles. And you could see where they moved from Castro Rocks out to Point Reyes. And where Drake's Bay, they went down to Pacifica. In another, they were tagged in Tamales Bay, and they went all sorts of places south, and one went up to the Russian River. So you see there's a lot of individual variation. When you study sea lions, there tends to be a northward migration of adult males from their breeding sites down in Southern California. But with harbor seals, there's a lot of individual variation of where they move. And this is yet another study where we tagged them at Castro Rocks, and then this is one individual over several months. went first into Sausalito area and hauled out there, and then went up to Bolinas Lagoon and hauled out there, went out to towards the Farallones and fed around that area, then went up to Double Point. So they're visiting little villages along the way as they're traveling north, and then they travel back to Castro Rocks eventually. But you can see there's a lot of individual variation. And that's why having all of these haul out sites are important for individual harbor seals, where they know they can go and rest after a long swim. The population of harbor seals in the state of California was estimated to be about 30,000, but that was 10 years ago, and the Department of Fish and Game and NOAA has not surveyed the state again, and we don't really know what the statewide population is, but we have continued to study harbor seals in Central California, including Russian River and Sea Ranch, and we know that the numbers have been changing a bit, but fairly stable for the past decade. And here's just for Point Reyes, all the sites where we counted from Bolinas Lagoon, with this orange one down here. You can see it's starting to go up in areas, whereas this one is Double Point, this kind of light green one. Is one of the most important colonies in the state, and all of a sudden it's crashing. What's that all about? Whereas Drake's Estero is also a very important site, and it's continuing to be fairly stable. There was a big peak here where animals from Double Point disappeared and they went to Drake's Estero. That in part explains that peak. But the thing I want to emphasize again is having alternate sites is really important for harbor seals to shift to. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but note an increase in Bolinas Lagoon, an increase in Drake's Estero, but a decrease at Double Point. And here are combining all of those sites together, and the population has remained fairly stable for the past 20 years. These are the adult numbers, and here are the pup numbers. But certain years, the numbers go down, and they tend to go down during El Nino years. And these were the El Nino years. This is the average, and this is the range around the average, and below the average were El Nino years. So they will skip giving birth during an El Nino year. They can't retain a pregnancy. Now shift to monitoring of stranded animals. I worked with the Marine Mammal Center for decades, and their researchers there, and Cal Academy of Sciences and Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. And we documented over the past 20 years, 3 different mortality events where lots of harbor seals died suddenly in a short period of time. In 97, about 100 we documented. And then in 2025 at one site, Tamales Point, and at that one site, we were able to identify a coronavirus, kind of like COVID, but not COVID, but a coronavirus that killed about 25 harbor seals that we documented. And then 10 years ago, there was another die-off. So we like to track this because these die-offs can happen unexpectedly, like happened on the East Coast where they had a fossa distemper that killed off about 50% of the seals. Weather also changes their habitat, and the seals adapt to that. The haul-out sites can change because of changes in big storm events, and the sand spits erode or they are created. So this is between 2002, where you had a small spit there, and 2009 was a huge spit. And the sand from here gets shifted into the estero and creates more habitat for the seals. Common predators for harbor seals include bears. Now, this is not here, but if we had black bears or grizzly bears, we might have them. But here, coyotes are a new predator that are just expanding at Point Reyes in the past 25 years. Sharks and orcas. This is a picture of an orca feeding on a harbor seal off of Vancouver Island. And I got that off of the web. You can look at it. It's a video. but it shows you the range of predators. Most of them are marine, but harbor seals are vulnerable to terrestrial predators. One that we don't have anymore are grizzly bears, which would have a large effect on where harbor seals might be willing to come on shore and rest. And they are disturbed when either by a predator or by humans when they're resting on shore. And you know this response, and I'm sure you've seen it at Sea Ranch, where they first alert, they raise all their heads up. What's that? They flush into the water or flush towards the water, but they're reluctant to go in, and then they'll enter the water if it's a really big threatening disturbance. And there's short and long-term effects from disturbance. Short-term is that you are disturbing that one resting period, or you might cause mother-pup separation. If it's a very small pup, it might get separated from the mother during the rush into the water. And here, this was caused by a boat going by. And then there are long-term effects. And this is what I've studied quite a bit, whereas reduced usage or abandonment of sites because of extensive disturbance, or seals shift to hauling out at night. As they do at Castro Rocks, they haul out at Castro Rocks more at night than during the daytime. And it may be because of the loud noise and people throwing bottles out of their cars as they drive across the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge, which we documented, and reduce pup production. So if you have a heavily disturbed site, the seal's a female might decide to go and give birth someplace else where she's not going to be disturbed as much. And so think of yourself. I need 8 hours sleep every day. And if I'm woken up by my husband snoring or somebody making a lot of noise at night, I go and sleep in another room if it's night after night after night. And this is how they're responding, because when they're on shore during the day, they're resting so that they can spend more time in the water and chase their food. And it's roughly 8 hours a day during the non-breeding season. During the breeding season, when they're giving birth, they need more time on land because they're nursing their pups. And they're all different sources of disturbance, from clam diggers to ultralights and just people walking on the shoreline, kayakers, and walking dogs. Dogs are like coyotes, so the seals are pretty intimidated by dogs. They're also intimidated by birds, and I'll get to that in a minute, but they don't like large birds like gulls or eagles or things like that. Now, is this disturbance? I've always been challenged by this. Is this disturbance? Well, this seal decided to hook a ride, as did this one, on kayaks. I don't know if that's happening in the Russian River, but down in Monterey Bay, it's pretty common. And down in Monterey Bay, they also like to be scratched on their bellies. I don't know if I've heard that up here, but it's they're curious. When they're in the water, they're curious. They're not threatened, and they'll easily approach people. Sometimes they might be dangerous, and that's something to be aware of. They often will approach scuba divers out of curiosity, but then maybe you're too close to their pup if they're in the water, and they might bite you. So always be aware of them being around and what might be around with them. And again, look at those serrated teeth. They can cause a lot of damage. I want to give you one example of a site that was abandoned and then recolonized by seals based on changes in management. And this is a site in Tomales Bay called Hog Island. And the seals abandoned the site in the early 90s because kayaking became very popular and people were camping on Hog Island and kayaking out to it. And in the mid-1990s, the Park Service restricted access to the island and put out a big education campaign. And in around 2006, the seals started hauling out again. And in the past several years, they've got numbers up to 200 adults and 15 pups. So here they are hauled out at the eastern edge. So just by giving them some space, they were able to come back and use the site, because it's important in Tomales Bay where herring are important. Which gives me the transition into marine conservation for you to understand about harbor seals and where they fit into marine conservation. The conservation ethic is not new. It's even Captain Scammon, who hunted gray whales, developed a conservation ethic where he said no more hunting of gray whales in Scammon's Lagoon. Let them have calves. And that ethic is a common thread throughout history. And the Marine Mammal Protection Act is the best example of that, which was passed in 1972, which made it restricted disturbing seals or even attempting to disturb or hunt seals or whales. It was a blanket legislation. It would never pass today. It was amazing legislation, but it's been reenacted every 20 years. So for the lowly harbor seals, they're also affected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act. But also what's important are marine protected areas. And these can range from national parks to wildlife refuges to marine sanctuaries. Those are all examples of marine protected areas, but the highest level of a marine protected area is a marine wilderness, where power boats aren't allowed, but you can kayak there. And it's a quiet places. And Drake's Estero is the only one in North America on the western coast. There is one on Glacier Bay too, but they're a rare sighting to have. But I want to emphasize protection through education, and that's why I want to talk to you and emphasize to educate yourself so you understand how you personally or you collectively might influence the presence of predators or not. And changing climate is an important challenge that we all face. And so seals that haul out in these transition zones, which are both exposed at low tide but flooded at high tide, are going to be affected by rising seas. They're already affected, but they adapt to that. They shift to other areas. But there's a lot of uncertainty in climate change because we don't know how the oceans are going to change. And those oceanographic disruptions, will El Niños be more frequent? Here was what was called the Son of Blob and Godzilla that happened in 2015, and it was extremely warm waters, resulted in reduced krill, and remember krill are the basis of a food web, and larger harmful algal blooms that happened, and those affect the whole food web. So think about these elements that might have an influence on not just harbor seals, but the whole marine ecosystem. As you're well aware of in Sonoma County, I know you had a die-off at Bodega Head because it was unseasonably warm and no fog combination. But that's why marine protected areas are so important. And California has a network of marine protected areas. There's nothing like it in all of the world, this network. Lots of states and countries have marine protected areas, but not a network. And what I mean by a network, they're collectively stronger together. They may not be enormous, but they provide a quantity of sites where seals or fish or other organisms can seek refuge in areas. And they range from marine protected areas that are fully protected, where there's not even research allowed except by the Marine Protected Area Monitoring Program, or you have marine conservation areas where certain types of fishing are allowed. And the Russian River is one of these marine protected areas in Sonoma County. So this is an important, in some of these marine protected areas have been in place for 10 years. The ones in Southern California have been in place for 20 years. And what they show is that they provide resilience for changes in climate. So you have a very diverse species, you have abundant species in these reserves compared to non-reserves. You have all of the components that are important for a diverse ecosystem, and a diverse ecosystem is a resilient ecosystem. So remember that. So that's, I conclude my talk with that. And I wanted to acknowledge people who volunteer to monitor harbor seals up in Sea Ranch and the Russian River. They're the backbone of all of the studies that are going on in California. And as I said, the state has not been monitoring harbor seals in 20 years. This is in 10 years. They have not monitored harbor seals in 10 years. But you as volunteers, some of you who may be listening today, are the backbone to ensure that we do understand what's happening with these populations. So I can answer questions now. And I also want to say that if anybody has further questions, they can email me, and Sandy or Catherine can share my email with people if they want to know things in more detail. But I hope this provides you with kind of the basis of understanding harbor seals, and then build on that and drill down and understand about the science behind the seals in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We do have a number of questions that have been submitted in the chat room, and people who actually sent me in advance some questions. So we may not get through all the questions. So
as I said, you can email me if you want to follow up.
And I'll distribute them. So so I have two questions that are sort of along the same lines, having to do with how long the moms stay with their pups after birth. I guess there's a little confusion about that. Does the mom leave immediately after she weans the pup, or does she stick around and help the pup learn how to feed? How does that go?
That's a good question. And it's not a complete answer, but I can tell you my experience for Point Reyes and other people's experience. The female tends to stay with a pup for 30 days. And when I had satellite and radio tagged harbor seals, at around 30 days, they left the area. They completely left the area. I was tracking them, and they went to Point Reyes headlands from Drake's Estero. So they went away for a few days, and then they came back, and I never saw them with their pup again. That doesn't mean that they did not reunite with a pup in the water, but it was a very clean break. But I've talked to other people who said, well, they kind of interact more off and on. I have personally never seen a seal teaching its pup how to swim or chase prey, but I can imagine easily that they do, because the pup swims at birth. So they're with the female in the water column while she's feeding, because she doesn't fast like an elephant seal during the feeding period, during the pupping season. So she's with that pup constantly. She's not going to leave it alone unless she's scared off from it, or as the pup gets older, they might wander off, just like a teenager wandering off. Oh, I think I'll go and look at that. You might end up with separations then for short periods of time, but they tend to be very close, certainly for that first 10 days. Pups have been shown to be able to eat fish at about 10 days. So they may be capturing fish with a female after 10 days. But my experience is it's fairly abrupt. And the female left the area and was not seen with a pup after that.
So following up on that, so what you're saying is a mom who's still nursing a pup is not going to leave the pup on the beach by itself intentionally?
No, yes, that's correct. I rarely would see a female leave a pup alone on the beach unless she's been scared off, and she'll be sitting in the water nearby. This is with very small pups that can't maneuver very well. They're precocious. They can swim at birth, but not very well. And they ride on the back of the females when they're very young. So a very young pup, I'll give you an example. Looking at Drake's Estero, very young pup with a female, and a coyote comes down on the beach, and the female the seals rush into the water because there's a coyote, and one little pup might be left there because it can't maneuver very well. Now that pup could be prey to the coyote, but it also, a female, I've observed females grab the neck of a pup and drag it into the water. So there's a range of experience, as you would expect with any species, humans included, where you have experienced females and inexperienced females, ones that haven't given birth very often, maybe just once or twice, and just learning how to protect their pups. They're different. individuals. And this is just like any animal, you have different individuals and how they behave. But generally, a female will not leave their pup alone, at least for the first 2 to 3 weeks, unless forced off a beach.
And someone just sent a question on the chat that's sort of a follow-up to that. What percentage of pups might be abandoned without a mother in a rookery? I asked you that question.
Yeah, that's a good question too, and that varies by site. If it's a site that's disturbed a lot, there might be a lot of individual lone pups on the beach. And I'll give you another example. Remember I said double point numbers were declining, and that's because there's a coyote showing up there, and the seals are charging into the water, and they're leaving their very small young pups on the beach. And so some of them are being preyed on by the coyotes, but also some are just been separated from their mother, and they're lone pups on the beach. And that's unusual, but it's because of frequent disturbance by coyotes. You could also say the same as a frequently disturbed site. Tomales Bay is disturbed regularly by boats and clam diggers that come by where the seals haul out. And there tend to be lone pups that are picked up there and go to the Marine Mammal Center. Years ago, when I was looking at lone pups compared amongst the sites that I was studying, there were more lone pups that came from Tomales Bay than, say, from Drake's Estero, because there was more disturbance at that time at Tomales Bay. So I think that answers the question.
Someone asked, is it true that mom's milk really is the consistency of mayonnaise?
Well, I haven't tasted it for texture, but it's very thick, and for elephant seals, extremely thick, and then it changes during the life of the pup, because elephant seals fast, but I doubt that it changes much with harbor seals, because they continue to eat throughout the time that they're with pups. They may eat less, but they're still eating through that period of time, whereas elephant seals are fasting.
So what percentage of fat is the milk? Do we know?
The good rule of thumb is about 50%.
50%. Okay. Someone wanted to know, what's the adaptive value of having ear flaps like the sea lions, or no ear flaps like the harbor seals? What is the adaptive value of that?
Yeah, how did that evolve? But you know what's interesting is phosid seals, which would be elephant seals and harbor seals, are really deep divers. And so it probably, the ear evolved with their going deeper and deeper where they're foraging, whereas sea lions don't dive very deep for their prey. And they're also evolved from different ancestors. So sea lions evolved from bears, a common ancestor of bears, whereas harbor seals and elephant seals evolved from a common ancestor of otters. So those two forces caused the loss of that ear flap.
Is the blastocyst arrested at a certain stage of development until implantation?
Yes, it's in a static state. It's 4 cells. Of blastocyst is 4 cells, and it's floating in the uterus. And then it's probably photoperiod, changes in photoperiod. So September, changes in light would probably trigger, at least what I've read, triggers changes in hormones, and then it implants in the uterine wall.
Back to the mom-pup relationship, how important is the post-weaning period to pup survival? Do we have any statistics on that?
No, it's a whole black hole of understanding.
Oh.
When I first started talking about harbor seals, I said they're common, but they're really hard to study. And part of that, I study both elephant seals and harbor seals, and elephant seals are a lot easier to study because they're not fearful of people. And so you can learn a lot more about elephant seals in some ways than harbor seals, which you can't even get close to study easily at all. So that mother-pup relationship is really hard to tease out, especially when they're in the water. And it's hard to capture them, to put individual tags on, to follow that relationship. I know of only one person who tagged both females and pups. And so that gives you an idea of how rare it is. There may be others who have done it, but I only know of one person who did study both pups and tags. And one of the reasons why it's rarely done is because you can cause mother-pup separation if you're tagging pups and moms at the same time.
Right. So what is the survival rate for pups for the first year of a harbor seal's life? What's the survival rate? Do we know that?
Yes, there have been several studies looking at that in California in particular, and also by the Marine Mammal Center comparing rehabilitation pups versus wild pups. And the survival rate is a little less but not a lot. It's about 50%. And that's interesting because it's very similar to what you see with many mammals. You get a high mortality that first year because the animals are learning. They're learning maybe some from their mother. They're learning, since they're not like sea lions staying 6 months with their mother, they're only a month with their mother. They're learning from each other. And when I tagged yearlings, the yearlings hung out together. So maybe they're learning from each other or watching other animals and then experience. Remember what I said, that seals were highly individual and where they dispersed? Well, that first year, maybe that had a big effect on their survival, is where they landed that first year in the wintertime. For those that went up to Sonoma Coast, they had good luck. They found lots of rockfish and they found lamprey at the Russian River. But for others, maybe they weren't so lucky. In San Francisco Bay, there was a study looking at harbor seals and their diet, and they switched prey from what they normally would prefer to eat, and herring, to an introduced species, yellowfin goby. So there is an adaptive capacity of these animals to adjust their diet. But that first year, they are able to learn or not. After that, survivorship is very high because they've learned, and then they tend to go back to the place where they had gone before.
I should have asked this question when we were talking about delayed implantation. Someone wanted to know if harbor seals, are they the only marine mammals that have delayed implantation?
No, many temperate marine mammals have delayed implantation. And when I mean temperate, those that reside more in the temperate latitudes as opposed to the equator. But there are a range of species that have delayed implantation. Many bat species have delayed implantation, for example. And you find it all throughout the species of mammals. And it's tied to photoperiod, changes in daily light cycles.
And in the mating, are the meritories, did the males defend their meritories? Is that how they establish meritories out in the water or on the rookery, or where are they establishing these meritories? And are they defending them like elephant seals defend their territory?
Yes, that's a good question. A meritory is a marine territory, so it's in the water. Mm-hmm. And they do defend it, like they attacked the hydrophone of my friend who did that study. And the size of the meritory seems to vary significantly, and it's probably affected by the shape of the the haul out site where the females are hauled out. Now, I haven't seen any other studies that looked at these maritories, but there have been some studies down in Monterey where they looked at males vocalizing underwater together, kind of like a lek. And a lek is what is described as males that hang out and demonstrate together their prowess. So an example of leks is usually referred to for ungulates. Different types of deer have leks, but also it appears that harbor seals might have it because they are not sexually dimorphic. The males and the females are the same. The agility probably has more to do, and their ability to vocalize underwater, more to do with male differences than it has to do with an elephant seal on land, where he has his nose to trumpet with and his mask to fight and big teeth. It seems that they evolved to be able to vocalize in opaque water near haul out sites.
When individual seals migrate, do they tend to join new groups of seals at their haul out sites?
Yes, so that individual that I gave as an example of tagged at Castro Rocks, it left as an individual. There may have been untagged animals that it traveled with, and other researchers have noted individuals traveling together. But this individual left Castro Rocks, went to Sausalito, then went to Bolinas Lagoon and hauled out there where there are other groups of harbor seals. So think of these as little villages that the seals are going to visit as they're going up the coast to where they think there might be some good foraging during the non-breeding season. Or they come back to Drake's Estero or Double Point to give birth after they've had their winter visit up in the Russian River. And several of the animals that I tagged at Drake's Estero went north. They went to the Russian River. They often went to the mouths of rivers, the Smith River and Duncan's Mills, and up the river there. Penny Island, one animal hung out at Penny Island in the Russian River. So they're very individual in where they went, and there were other seals where they went.
I think that's all of the email questions. Is the increase in harbor seals at Drake's Estero the effect of the Obama administration's application of the Wilderness Act to allow expiration of the lease for the Drake's Beach Oyster Company? Are you able to answer that question?
I don't know that I can answer it yet because we're still studying that transition. But the fact that seals disturbed at Double Point shifted to Drake shows that it was important for them as an alternate site from Double Point. And I want to emphasize again the importance of alternative haul out sites. There's no, it's too early to say because that happened only a few years ago, that transition, and the park is still monitoring the recovery of the Estero bottom type and things like that. So ask me in 5 years and maybe I'll be able to answer that.
Someone wants to know, sea lions and harbor seals seem to overlap their habitats. What determines which species is where?
They overlap when there's superabundant prey and they feeding on the same thing. So Pacific herring are an important food for harbor seals and sea lions, California sea lions, during the winter months. And so you're going to see them overlap in their foraging, but you rarely see them overlap on their haul out sites because harbor seals are using these transitional haul out sites, and they're small compared to sea lions. Sea lion is about 700 pounds, so they're bigger and more aggressive. And they would be dominant in certain types of habitat, but also sea lions can climb up on rocks above above that intertidal line where they can rest without being influenced by the tide cycles.
We have a question here about a raft. I suspect that what this person is observed is probably sea lions and not harbor seals, but here's the question. At Black Point, I saw a raft with 50 or so seals, some belly up, some on top, jumping in and out of that live raft. Is that common?
For sea lions, it's very common. For harbor seals, not so much.
Right.
But you can see groups of harbor seals in the water in kelp beds. They feel protected in kelp beds. Predators are less likely to get them, i.e. sharks, in kelp beds. So they feel quite comfortable bottling together, but not in big racks and leaping out of the water, not so much.
Then finally, I think this will be one last question, which is, are there myths or misconceptions you'd like to dispel when it comes to harbor seals?
Oh, myths.
Myths,
Yeah.
myths.
Well, all creatures have, they're mythological. They're called silkies in Ireland and Scotland because the myth is that the seals transform into people and back again. So that's an important myth that carries over in the mermaid myth. But just to dispel, I don't want to dispel that myth because I think it's kind of fun. But the myth, there's a strong myth that seals are taking out all the salmon in the Russian River, for example. And there was this one study, just one study, by a student, a graduate student, who found that they were actually feeding not on steelhead or salmon so much as they were feeding on lamprey, which feed on salmon and steelhead. Lamprey are a sucker type fish that will leave big holes in salmon. And so that was an interesting myth about what harbor seals were doing to the salmon population in the Russian River. And in fact, the salmon population is declining in the Russian River because it's being dewatered, and it's being changed that way, and not so much because of harbor seals. So that's a big myth. Harbor seals do like salmon, though. I don't mean to say they don't, as I showed in that picture, but it's not a dominant part of their food. Another myth is that females often leave their pups on the beach while they go out to feed. Well, that's not been my experience. If they're leaving a pup on the beach, it's probably because they've been disturbed and they went into the water and they're nearby. And that's why there's that 48 hours or 24, I thought it was 24 hours that the Marine Mammal Center says leave until, to give a chance for a female to come back. And it's best to give them the space to come back to retrieve their pup. But as I said earlier, not all females are very experienced, and some abandon their pups just because they're inexperienced females and they just haven't figured it out yet. So it's complex. There are no simple answers to that.
Yeah, and as a Marine Mammal Center volunteer, I've heard over and over again that moms will leave their pups to go out and feed, so on the beach. So I'm not sure about, and now they're requiring a 48-hour watch.
Well, that's interesting.
So.
Well, maybe they've found different studies, but for my experience, I haven't seen that. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's not been my experience.
Well, thank you. We're at 5 o'clock. I didn't ask you this before we scheduled, but would it be all right for us to make the video of your presentation available? Are you good?
Yes, I'm fine with that.
Great. Well, I think we got through most of our questions. So.
And again, if people want to drill down and learn more, I'm gladly answer questions. And I'm not the source of all information on harbor seals. There are lots of studies out there, and they're found throughout the northern latitudes of the world. So you can expect to see different behaviors in different parts of the country too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sandy, did you want to say anything in closing? I guess not. All right.
You're on mute, Sandy.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank all the participants and especially you, Sarah. It was a very educational and informative. We appreciate you spending your time with us.
Thank you for the opportunity. Take care and go out and enjoy the sunset.
I'm heading out right now.
Okay.
So long, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye.